2 stories to read with you occurring 2 months apart to the same follower in the state of Michigan. So in April of last year, they decided that they want to go visit their friend who lives about 30 minutes away for spring break. So they just hang out together and have fun all day, but when it turns nighttime, they decide this is a perfect time to explore the woods. I am immediately stressed. Their friend had been in these woods 100 times. He knew his way around, and he knew that there was a very pretty clearing on the other side of these woods that our follower needed to see. As they're entering the woods, they decide to pick up 2 big old sticks because wildlife is unpredictable, and I'm pretty sure they're going to find out that it's not just wildlife that is unpredictable. So they start walking and pretty soon find out that they cannot find the trail because it's covered in leaves. So they are just on their own in these woods, and whenever they come to the creek, they notice that everything went silent. So the friend's like, I'm gonna toss a stick. Like, I'm not really sure why, but the follower was like, do not toss that stick. Do not make a sound like that. We need to go. Not only do we need to go, we need to do it so very quietly. So they take off as quiet as possible, but they still start hearing pacing footsteps behind them. The follower knew not to look, but the friend did. And what did he see? Something tall and skinny with gray skin. He looked quickly and immediately looked back. The follower drops their stick at the tree line as to not take any part of the forest with them, and the other friend does not. Since then, that friend has reported feeling like things watch him consistently. I have heard a lot of stories of the things in the woods looking like that, just tall, gray, skinny things, especially in the mountains. I know people personally that have seen the tall, gray, skinny things, which I think is just what they look like if they don't take the, like, what's it called? Like looks of something or someone else. All right, let's get on to the second story. Like I said, these are 2 months apart, so this happened in June. So they were at a different friend's house with even more friends this time. They were all actually a part of the theater program, so they were just sitting around watching some of their old tapes. So while they're sitting around, they discover that one of their friends' headlights is pretty messed up and they're going to be driving home in the dark, so they all go out as a group to try and fix these headlights. So as everyone's outside, the follower hears something from the woods calling for them, and no one else in the group is hearing this. And for some reason, this follower goes to the woods. Not only do they go to the woods, they run to them. Thankfully, a concerned friend follows them because why are you bolting to the woods right now? They describe this voice as guiding them to a location because they have no idea where they're going. They're just going. And when they immediately get to the spot, they can't move anymore. They start wheezing and gagging because they can no longer breathe, and it feels like something is preventing it from happening, just preventing them from getting oxygen. Thankfully, the friend followed them and got them out of that spot, and as soon as they moved, they could breathe fine again. And for those of you who ask, what happens if these things actually get you? There you go. That is what happens. Even if you are constantly seeing and interacting with spirits, that does not mean that one encounter might not terrify you. You never really get used to stuff like this. So let me tell you about what happened to one of our followers during the lockdown. So they're sitting in their living room around like 4 or 5, and they're just minding their business. They said their walls are super thin, like they can even hear someone walking up their hill outside, and they're not in the Appalachian Mountains, but they are near mountains. They notice out their window that their neighbor's motion sensor light has went off, but they have headphones in and they're like, okay, I guess someone's walking and I just didn't hear it. They then hear a knock right on the front door, right where they are sitting, followed by a man's voice going, hello, is anyone home? Open up the door. He was knocking the entire time he was talking, and the knocking sounded like it was on the door, but the voice sounded like it was in the room. So they're running through things in their head that it could be maybe their dad called someone to repair something, but they were the only one awake. They could hear their dad sleeping in the next room. So why would he call someone and then not be awake when they come? So while they hear the knocking continuing, they get up slowly and quietly, creep over to the door, and look out the curtain. You think anyone was there? Do you think anyone was there? There was no one in the driveway, and no one was running away. They would have heard them. So they go, sit back down, and they're like, what is happening right now? So as they're sitting there trying to figure out what they just experienced, that motion sensor light goes off again. And then they hear that exact same voice downstairs talking to their dad while they hear their dad snoring in their room. So their dad's not downstairs. Why is this voice downstairs? So the next day at around noon, they are in their bed doing their virtual learning thing, and they decide they want a snack. So they take their blanket off of their bed and kick it to the bottom, go get a snack, and when they come back, that blanket is pulled up to the top. But it gets worse. Not only is the blanket itself pulled up, they can see the outline of what they think is a man underneath that blanket. So they, without hesitating, rip that blanket up, and there's no one. There's nothing there. No one is home while this is happening, and later on that day, they start hearing things coming from their dad's room. They just sit there and listen because if someone has broken in, they have no means to defend themselves at this point. As they're sitting there, their closet door whips open. This door is heavy. Like, you have to really nudge it to open it, and it just casually flew open along with the attic door being open. No. And then it's time to go to bed. Was that a car horn or a siren? Anyways, so as they're getting ready to go to sleep, they start hearing what sounds like nails dragging, and on top of that, they're hearing panting like a dog in sets of threes outside their door. But it's not their dog, and no one's like in that area, so what? They see a tall shadow with a hat on, and it's got some sort of light emitting from it. This thing just stayed around for days, and it got so bad with the negative energy it was giving off that it was hard for them to sleep in their room. They said that energy is still there, and they've tried every method they can think of to get rid of it, but the heavy presence and the shadows are still there. The things happening in threes and just the negative vibes, there's no way it can be anything good. Things that don't respond to like normal cleansings freak me out because you have to do such in-depth things just to get rid of them, to even nudge them. That was terrifying. Yeah, I don't like the like panting. Ew, I don't like that. That like made my skin crawl. I don't know why that was the thing that got me instead of the outline of the man under the covers, but like the panting got me. In Iowa, there sits a house so haunted that a family had aftermath after they left. So let's talk about the year of terror that our follower endured in this house when they were 13 and 14. So this house was 100 years old. Like, the garage was kind of updated, but it was still made to hold like horse and buggy type cars. And this was not a rural house by any means. It was in town, but the previous owner just wanted to keep the charm. I honestly kind of love that. That's adorable. Like, no one else has that. That's so cool. Instantly upon moving in, the follower was like, "Mom, something's up with this house." And their mom was kind of skeptical to paranormal stuff, so they were like, "It's fine. You're fine." But they just felt something off with that house and even the land that it sat on. But anyways, they move in. But not too long after moving in, a woman in like 1800 style clothing would be seen wandering the house by many relatives. And it wasn't just relatives, even a neighbor saw. And then a little girl started to be seen by even more people. She was probably between the ages of like 4 and 6, and she was pretty active. They had a little sister, and the little sister would literally play with this little girl and say she was her friend. Everyone in the house would see this entity from all hours of the day, but she was really active at night, running around, giggling, just having a blast. They even mistook this ghost for the little sister sometimes. So the little sister that saw this little girl ghost was 5, and she shared a room with the other sister who was 9, and this other sister was creeped out. She would come in the room and just hear this 5-year-old sister speaking to seemingly nothing and would get so weirded out and terrified of it. Because this little girl would be sitting there just having full conversations, and honestly, I don't blame the 9-year-old. Like, sleeping in that room would be an Olympic sport for me. So at this point, you're probably like me. As I was reading this story, I was like, this is so wholesome. These people loved this house so much, they just never wanted to leave. Let me tell you, not everything in that house was good. Pretty soon, one of the sisters would come to their mom and be like, "There is a dark figure with no face in my closet that I keep seeing." The sister said, "They don't speak, and I'm starting to see them in other places of the house. They're following mom around, and they do not like her. But they really like the 1-year-old baby that's in the house." And this is when activity started getting really scary in the house, and they would start hearing weird sounds coming from the baby's room. Knocking on the walls, the doors, things going missing, the whole thing in that baby's room. They even watched once as something flew off of the bathroom sink and collided with their mother's head. Things got worse and worse, and their dog became so terrified that they had to give them to their Nana, which the dog thrived there. It was fine, but they were too scared to leave the dog alone in this house. And then there was another entity that made itself known. An older, very skinny, tall man with dark eyes who was also not from this time. And this guy would make eye contact with people, which I just don't like. I don't like it when people do that. This family was not religious in the slightest, but the fear that they were feeling had them putting up crosses everywhere. But nothing was working. At one point, the entire family ended up sleeping in the living room together, like the Conjuring style, where the family just stayed together, because everyone was too scared to be by themselves. It was destroying their lives, to put it plainly simple. No one could sleep, no one could live, everyone was too scared to be in their home. It was a nightmare. So eventually they move, and something follows them to their new house. Things definitely felt better, but it didn't take long for doors to start closing on their own and stuff like that. After a while, things completely stopped, and they don't know if maybe their mom sought outside help or if it just got bored, but thankfully everything got quiet. And I am so glad that it stopped and that things are calm, and I hope you live a calm and paranormally boring life from now on, because whoa. But I want to know if the new owners are experiencing things so badly. Like, I know this person does not have that information to give me, but I want to know. So in 2020, there was of course not much to do in the United States and the rest of the world. So to pass the time, our follower and their friend would bike on the exact same trail every single day. But one day as they're biking and come along this trail, the trail's closed off for construction. So instead of going home, they're like, hey, we already have our bikes, let's find another. They both notice whenever they start on this trail, something's off, but they didn't really believe much in this stuff at the time, so they just kept going. You might not believe, but that gut feeling does. So as they're getting deeper into the trail, into the tree-filled trail, it starts getting darker, and it's not just the trees making the sky seem dark. And this was happening at 4 p.m. in July. It should not be dark. So they look at each other and they're like, hey, it's getting dark, perhaps we turn around. And as they turn around and start heading off of this trail, they start hearing mumbling coming from the trees just everywhere. And on top of that mumbling, they are smelling something rotting. Eventually the mumbling gets farther and farther behind them, and their friend is gone, like way up the trail, and our follower's kind of far behind. And our follower decides to turn around and look behind them to see if something is wrong. As they turn around, they are met with something that looks almost human, peeking from behind the tree. They immediately turn their heads, as they knew they were not supposed to see that. And they were not alone in seeing that, as their friend also saw it. Now let's fast forward a few years later to 2022. So our follower's bored, and they decide to call up that same friend, and they're like, hey, you want to go on a walk? And they go down a walk on this same path because the other one is now gone. Big mistake. Big mistake. So they start going down this trail, and they're not hearing the mumbling, but that smell comes back. Pretty soon their friend gets a call from their boyfriend saying something came up, and they turn around to head out. And as they're leaving, the smell gets worse and worse. Our follower turns around, as it smells like it's right behind them at this point, and is met with that same figure peeking around a tree. They haven't been back to that trail since, but they have felt like they're being watched consistently. Their house is surrounded by trees, and they now hear the mumbling outside of their own house. And on top of hearing that mumbling, they are smelling this smell inside their house. I have thoughts and I have advice. Something that lurks around those Wisconsin woods took interest to you. Let this be a lesson to everyone that even if you are not in the Appalachian Mountains, if something is off, ignore it. Do not look at it. Because once it knows that you notice it, you're its. You are its new obsession. And it will come with you. It will come with you every single time. I would recommend aligning those doors and windowsills with salt or black salt. Also make sure to get every corner of your home salted. You'll want to cleanse your space, especially inside your house, since you are smelling that. So use an herb bundle, use an incense of whatever you enjoy, and just open a window and think positive thoughts. Clear that negativity out of the space and immediately fill it with positivity, or it's gonna fill back up with negative energy. That's something I learned recently on here, and boy did it explain a lot. Always fill up your space with positivity. And while you're at it, also cleanse yourself, and do not go back to that trail, ever. Ever. You came back that second time and that thing was like, oh, they want me to come home with them for sure. You don't want that, so don't go back there. I have a bit of a longer follower story today, so grab a snack and get comfy, and let's get into it. So this person sent in 2 different stories that happened in the same room in the state of North Carolina. Story number 1. This occurred when they were 17 years old and they had just woken up and were facing their TV. But when they look up, they don't just see their TV there. They are met with what looks like a person crouching on their knees. And they say that because it was around 3 feet tall, but it had a blanket thrown over it. Their groggy brain found this hilarious and decided to poke it on where its head would be, and it fell backwards and came right back up. And they did this because they thought it was their boyfriend. And they just kept doing it, kept poking it, and it would just go back and come back. But then they start to wake up a bit more, and they're like, my boyfriend doesn't live with me. That's definitely not my boyfriend. For some reason, they decide to poke it a few more times and then start backing up to go to the other side of their bed, trying to get away. This thing starts to rise as it is standing up, like literally the scene of a scary movie. There's a crack opened in their door, so their sister's walking by as this is happening, and they lock eyes, and their sister sees the terror on their face. Their sister calls their name, they look back, it's still there. Then when they look away and look back again, that blanket is floating to the ground. They told their sister what was going on, and it was just pushed away as sleep paralysis, but they were fully awake. They said it felt human, like they definitely felt something under that blanket, and it felt like a head. That is terrifying. I feel like it went on and you did way too much for it to just be groggy brain. What? But I also, to make light of the situation, just imagine like you're trying to scare someone, like you're a spirit, and you go in there and you just have a sheet over your head, like that scene in Beetlejuice when they try to scare like the Deetses by putting those sheets on their heads, and like the person just laughs at you and pokes your head. I find that funnier than I should. Okay, story number 2. This happened when they were 20 years old, like I said, in the same room. This occurred between 2 and 3 a.m. when they decided to open their bedroom window to get some fresh air. Their mom is maybe like 20 feet away in the living room. Their dad's asleep in the room next to them. So while they're sitting there at the window, relaxing, lost in their own thoughts, they hear an angry man's voice call their name. I'm not going to say their name because I don't know if they want me to, but they called their name. Their name's kind of uncommon. I've met maybe one person with this name in my life, so it's kind of strange for someone to be yelling that. So they tell themselves, it's your mind playing tricks on you. No one's calling your name. It's like 3 a.m., dude. And they started to believe themselves until they heard their name again, but it was louder and more drawn out. So they slam the window shut and immediately call their boyfriend, a different guy from the last time, because they're like, he's definitely playing a prank on me. He's not the best guy anyway, so maybe I made him mad and he's just trying to get back at me. So when he answers the FaceTime, he is in bed very confused, and their heart just sunk. Their dad's asleep, they can hear him snoring, and it's not their neighbors because why would they do that? And now we have a story from current times, so a little bonus third story. They're now 24 and live in a hotel with their husband and 2 dogs. The hotel they're living in is located in Southern Virginia, and I am also in Southern Virginia, and it is weird here. But this hotel is surrounded by woods on each side, and they keep having some weird experiences with deer. Anytime they take their dogs out at night, it just seems like deer wander into their space where they shouldn't be. But this deer will stop and stare at them, and upon staring, they notice that it does not look like a normal deer. Like its neck is super long and its head is huge. This particular deer is different than all of the other deer. None of the others look like this, but this one will just stand there and stare at you, and it'll start to look like it's shifting. And when this happened, nature was silent around them. So whenever this was happening, they looked down to check on their dog. When they look back up, the deer looks normal. It didn't feel like this deer wanted to do them harm, but they just knew in their heart that that was not a deer. This was the night that they started getting touched. They've also been asking for signs for a medical problem that they're having, and they can't really afford to go to the doctor right now, and they just keep getting touched. Fingers tracing down their back, poking them, things like that. And they asked if they were okay by just acknowledging it, and my answer is it depends. Typically, and from like personal experience, if you acknowledge it, it is now interested in you. I would try to avoid going outside by myself if possible, and don't really look outside at night if you can help it. Try to just not look deer in the eyes because they're probably not a deer if they're looking you in the eyes like that. Yeah, just be cautious. Imagine just minding your business on FaceTime with a friend working on a project when you experience one of the most terrifying things of your life. That is exactly what happened to a follower. So while drawing on a piece of fabric to cut and sew onto a jacket and talking with a friend, our follower heard a crunch at their window. It sounded like leaves or gravel crunching, and they ignored it. They thought that's probably a bear, raccoon, something like that. They live in the mountains, so wildlife. So then another crunch happens, and it is right at their window, super loud. So they drop literally what they're doing and turn to look at the window because what was that? And that's when they come face to face with what is at their window, and they drop their paintbrush, spilling purple paint everywhere. This figure was dark and had sunken in features on its face and had elf-like ears and a cloak. It was very small until it stood up and got taller and taller. It got to around 4 feet tall before our followers slammed their windows shut and said nope. After they got that window closed, they heard knocking all around their house. They said they're not sure what it was, but they hope they never see it again. I can tell you what that was. That was a fae folk. You met a fae. They don't all look like Tinkerbell, guys. I've never seen a fae, as far as I know. I definitely could have, and because there's so many different ones, they all look different. But I have had them leave me gifts and things like that, and it is alarming. But yeah, that was a fae. That was a fae. That was a fae. There is a mimic situation happening all the way in England. Our follower is really going through it right now and was asking for some advice, so I thought I would share their story with you guys as well. That's right, mimics are everywhere, not just in the US, not just in the mountains, they are everywhere. So they started off by saying they are not entirely sure of the supernatural. They can typically debunk videos and things like that. They're not sure where they stand, but something's been going on. The first thing that started happening was them hearing their own voice read the first 2 lines of one of their favorite books to them. They were home alone and they heard a knock on their bathroom door while they were doing their nighttime routine. They assumed it was just their dog's tail hitting the door until they heard themselves start reading. So this has just kept happening, and when it first started, the voice sounded almost identical, but now it's starting to deepen with every word. And then something horrifying happened. They receive a text from their friend saying, "Had so much fun, here's the picture you wanted, see you soon." That friend lived pretty far away, and they were not with them. So they informed their friend that that was not them, and yeah, everyone's scared now. So they said they saw my own mimic videos and thought it sounded a lot like theirs and wanted some advice. While I do not know how to get rid of these things, as I have tried everything to get rid of mine, I do know how to minimize its activity. They mentioned that they are not interacting with it, and that is the best thing that you can do. But now you're gonna have to tell the people around you to also not, unless they are positive that it is you. Much like a yummy sourdough starter, each time you interact, talk with this thing, anything like that, you are feeding it. You are just feeding it until it grows and grows and grows. There are different types of mimics around, all for different reasons, but this one sounds like it's wanting to take someone's place. So it is best to not fuel that one at all. But I hope things get better. Mimics are horrifying. Something is lurking around the woods in Oregon, and we have a follower's first-hand encounter with it, so let's get into it. So as a child, their parents would take them camping, and they were just always around the woods, and they just weren't scared of that area at all. So the fact that they're so comfortable with wooded areas makes it a little bit suspicious that the forest by their grandparents' house is just not right. So their whole life, they've just felt this eerie feeling with this area at their grandparents' house, and eventually they asked their mom about it, and she admits that she feels the same way. Their mom even shared of times she has been outside of their house and heard the sound of a baby crying. It's not like any other animal that she has heard, like a legit baby crying with no source. Their grandfather passed away in 2022 and activity skyrocketed. There's even footage on their Ring doorbell of their grandmother's statue being thrown so hard it shattered. And before y'all ask, they said they did not have that footage, and I was super bummed about it because that would have been something to see. But I'll tell you what they did send footage of. A cluster of unexplainable orbs on the Ring camera. They glow for a second and then fade away, and we're gonna look at that right now. So another time, they and some relatives were just outside in the garden enjoying life at their grandparents' house, when the guttural scream of a woman erupted all around them. The sound continued, it would stop periodically, but eventually it was circling them and they could hear 2 feet tapping the ground. And although it was very close, it was not as loud as it should have been considering just how guttural the scream was. So my first thought was bobcat or a fox, because I think foxes sound like that, but I know bobcats do. They make the most horrifying sound. It's literally just like a woman screaming. It is so alarming to hear in the middle of the night. But they went on to say that it was not a bobcat. There was something different about it. It wasn't a bobcat. They've heard bobcats. And everyone in their family that heard it, that knows what bobcats sound like, was like, that was not a bobcat. Ooh. This next occurrence happened pretty recently in October. Their grandmother owns a small antique business, and our follower and their parents were picking up some packages for her. So as they were walking out to the car carrying these packages, they heard what sounded like a kitten meowing. But then that sound morphed into what sounded like a duck, and then that sound changed to a baby giggling. and then back to a cat. The fact that that was morphing into different sounds, that was not an animal. That was not an animal. They did also attach some history of the property in, and that to me explains everything that this story has entailed. So their grandparents built this house in the 60s, and as people were exploring the property when it was being built, they found what they believe are native artifacts. Some necklaces and even some arrowheads were found. They also found a ball type object on the property, and our follower thought it was a cannonball, but upon research it is a ball that native children used to play with. There was an earthquake in the area 300 plus years ago that actually ended the lives of a lot of those people. That being on indigenous grounds, really, yeah, that checks. That will do it. Sometimes I will check my DMs and there's just the most horrifying, gut-wrenching, nightmarish story waiting for me. And today's is no different, but I refuse to suffer alone, so we shall read it together. It's a little bit long, so get comfy, grab your snacks, and come back. So this occurred in the summer of 22 when our follower and their mom moved back into their grandmother's house to help take care of her, as she was just diagnosed with dementia. This house is located in a very small town in the rural part of Nebraska, and it is haunted. Their mom even shared some stories with them of dreams they would have as a child in this house of being possessed, and this was a reoccurring thing that happened. One night she woke up and saw a man coming down the hall a bit hunched over, and she assumed that it was her brother coming back from a night of partying. The next morning, she got up, went down to see her mom. Her brother wasn't there, and she was informed that he did not come home last night, so that was not her brother. So here's the way the grandma's house is set up. So here's the front door, you walk into a hallway, and if you go right, there are bedrooms and a bathroom. The staircase to the basement is also right there. Our follower also shared an experience that they have had multiple times now while getting up in the middle of the night to go get a glass of water. So to get to the kitchen, you obviously have to walk, through that hallway past the basement door, and you go to the kitchen, and they keep having an urge to look into the basement. And they listened to that urge, and what they were met with was a head and an arm peeking around the wall staring. No, I don't like that. Why did I turn British? Badly British also, might I add. There was also an instance where their mom had shattered their knee so they couldn't really get up and down the stairs, and at this time they had a lot of kittens in the house. One day their mom could not find a kitten but suddenly heard it meowing, and this kitten had somehow gotten downstairs and trapped underneath a chair. And there is no logical way that that kitten would have knocked that chair over, just the right way to trap it. But the kitten's fine. So recently, like I said, they're living there now. Our follower had a friend over, and in the middle of the night, they decide to go into the kitchen to get a snack, and everything's okay. So they get their snack and go back to their bedroom, and then stuff gets weird. There's an older radio that they keep in that kitchen, and as soon as our follower was back in their bedroom, it starts blasting classical music. So they get up and go back in the kitchen to turn off this loud classical music, and they got the worst feeling of their lives. This feeling was so bad that it caused them to burst into tears, and they said they had this feeling of, if I stay here any longer, I am not safe. This happened every single night for a week. There's no way to describe why it was happening and why it was happening every single night. Another time, they were sitting in their living room, and they kept hearing 3 knocks coming from their ceiling. It would get louder and louder each time until eventually our follower said, I am not trying to bother you. I just want to sit here. I don't mean you any harm. There was one final knock and it stopped. They also had a psychic medium come in the house who said that there was a veil on the stairs of the basement, was down there for 45 seconds, and came sprinting back up those stairs. She said as she was running out of the house that something in her head screamed at her to leave and never come back, and she never did. She said there are 3 entities in the house. One is very bad and the other 2 are different. One of the other entities is the spirit of a teenage boy who just likes to mess with things. Like whenever our follower is getting ready, he will make the sounds of breaking mirrors happen throughout the house, and he's just playing around. The other entity is an older lady who is there to protect from the demonic presence. Our follower's mom did not have the best time growing up, and there was a certain relative who always stayed by and protected their mom, and they think that that is the spirit of that person. Also, more about the teenage boy, the medium said that maybe he is more active because our follower is around the same age, and he's just excited to have someone his age. The medium said he passed away on the Oregon Trail not far from their house. That was so sad and intense. I think definitely a cleansing of the space and setting up some protections from that negative energy is, a good idea, but the other 2, I would make sure to tell them that as long as they don't, scare you guys or mess with you, they are welcome as long as you want them there. But that one, I would try my best to get rid of him because ugh. This story is incredibly too creepy to be a coincidence, so let's get into it. So this story actually starts out being about our follower's mom, and this occurred whenever their mom and their dad lived in one of her friend's basements. Now the dad worked nights, and this occurred at night, so he never experienced this, but let me tell you what our friend's mom experienced for 2 weeks. Every night, for 14 days, our follower's mom would be laying in bed when she would feel the bed go down as if someone sat. The first night it happened, she tried talking to it because she thought it was our follower's dad, but it was not. Something told her to just stop, close her eyes, and not pay attention to it, and after a few hours, it would get up but still stay in the room. She just doesn't tell anyone about this, and like I said, for 2 weeks it happens every night. But on that next day after that mark, something else happens. She feels it crawl into bed with her, and they move out shortly after that. So then, after they move out of that basement, our follower moves back in with them, and our follower sleeps in the living room. They're laying in the living room trying to fall asleep, and they just feel something watching them, and that feeling does not go away. So they decide to turn to the wall when they feel something crawl into the bed with them. So the next morning, our follower tells their mom, and that is where their mom shares their story with them. And this house is creepy. They've even seen doors try to unlock themselves. While that hasn't happened anymore with the thing crawling in the bed, they can still feel it around the house. And they, and so do I, think that whatever was in that basement followed their mom. Please cleanse your space, pray, do whatever makes you comfortable to get rid of this thing, because it does not seem like a fun attachment to have. Things that wait until you're asleep to do sketchy stuff just irk me, because that's when you're vulnerable. It's time to cleanse. Something really weird happened on December 10th. My dad and I were heading out to go hunting around 5:30 in the morning, and my dad was telling me a paranormal story when we passed a lake we have near us. He switched the subject to a salt factory, and he's looking out the passenger side window when I see a flash of light. It popped up and disappeared within seconds, and it continued as we passed. It looked like it was hovering in between the two freeways. I told my dad, so he looked over it as we passed it. It flashed once more, and as it turned off, I saw around 13 little circles of lights dimming. After we finished hunting, we were driving back, and nothing was around that area. That's really creepy. My first initial thought before I read the 13 little lights was like a drone or something like that, but I don't think drones do the little lights, do they? Like, I could definitely be wrong and just not know my drones, but that doesn't sound normal. And like, why was it hovering? Like, the drone would make sense, maybe, and especially if there was a crash on the freeway, like maybe a news channel was trying to get footage, but I don't think drones look like that. That's weird. What do you guys think? It is time for another follower story. In 2018, I was starting high school and having some newfound independence. I spent my day at the library and outside of the bank to play games and talk to my friends about boys, Snapchat, and gossip. We went to different schools and talked about what it would be like when we went to university. As the day went on, I packed up my things and went home, touching things as I went past and peering into shops that were closed. I was so into my own world that I didn't realize how dark it was until I saw the streetlights were on. Usually I wouldn't think anything of this, but the silence that came with it was deafening. Not an insect, not a car to be heard. Only my footsteps and the swishes of a lone tree that looked like it had a side bob and a pair of skinny legs behind it. Being the naive 12-year-old I was, I thought it was my mother waiting for me, so I picked up the pace and called out to her. I didn't get a response, but I shook it off as her being occupied and made it past the tree with my arms wide to give her a hug. Only the legs were gone. Fear and panic seeped into my heart as I looked around, making sure to only stay where the light was and avoided being close to the tree. When I couldn't find any sight of my mother, I took a few steps back and made a straight run back to the house since I was already aligned with the footpath. In those 10 to 15 seconds, I made sure to not look back, even if it felt like it was all around me, taunting me with its presence. By the time I made it home, I was hysterically yelling for my mother to open the door and continuing to cry in her arms when she did. All the sheer terror I'd felt melted away when I stepped into my home. Being 18 and thinking back on it now, I honestly thought I would have lost something if I looked. I'm glad I knew not to go near the tree, and I'm thankful for my mother for believing me. I don't go out at night alone anymore, and I don't think I ever will. You were being hunted? You were being... Oh, that's terrifying. I'm so glad you knew not to look. Those videos were sent in by a follower, so let's read the story that went along with it and try to figure out what that was. For context, I'm a Louisiana native who is no stranger to the creatures of the night. They just kind of come with the territory out here. I moved to East Texas for school and live in a small neighborhood about an hour outside of Houston, a quiet suburb till recently. One more important detail is that the HOA of the neighborhood has a strict rule about having pets indoors at night due to the many animals who have lost their lives outside in the freeze years ago. Maybe not an actual guideline, but everyone follows regardless. At night you can usually hear the sounds of frogs, crickets, and the occasional bird. Nature tunes. For the past week or so, it'll get extremely quiet, followed by the sounds on the attached clips that you just heard. I managed to get them on 2 separate occasions. The other times I tried, it would stop immediately. I could be mistaken, but I know it wasn't a dog nor a person. This clip could be many things. Personally, I think it sounds a little bit like a mountain lion. Mountain lions sound horrifying whenever they make their little sounds. They sound like women screaming. It could be any animal like that. It could be a coyote, but regardless of whether it is the supernatural thing that you were thinking of or it's an animal, don't go outside. That's why I say when I talk about folklore a lot, it works for wildlife too. Like, you should still pay attention even if you don't believe in supernatural stuff. But I think it might be a mountain lion. I don't know where else to turn for help with this. I'm not from Appalachia. I've never been to Appalachia. And I've only been to one supposedly haunted town, and that was in Arkansas. Back in the summer of 2021, I had gone on a weekend trip with some of my friends to the historic Washington State Park. We stayed in the abandoned schoolhouse. We had gone on a haunted tour of the town with a special guide who was the designated ghost hunter. We toured a lot of the homes and did some testing with an EMF reader. Towards the end of the tour, we went into the Royston townhouse. I had a sick to my stomach feeling the entire time, and as soon as I walked into that kitchen, I passed out. When I woke up again, I was on the couch, screaming. We left immediately, but later that night I woke up to hands yanking on my arms, legs, and hair. My friends had decided that an Estes test would be a good idea, even though I disagreed. I stayed out of it. Even though my friend kept repeating stuff about how something was going to get us, or at least one of us. When we left that town, I thought we had left all of that behind. I no longer speak to these friends, partially because of this experience. Even before the trip, I had some pretty terrifying and inexplicable experiences, but wrote it off as nothing. I think this trip may or may not have set this off, but I don't know. Since this trip, it's been slowly getting worse, even to the point where my family has begun to see and hear something. And that something looks like me walking around our house and in places that I logically cannot be. My brother's school, my aunt's vacation home in a completely different state. I constantly wake up to something pulling on my ankles, and my cat constantly hisses at my closet and the space underneath my dresser. Clothing items, jewelry, and things that I wear often keep disappearing. When I went home, items fall off my shelves, and there's knocking on my windows and doors. I'm terrified. I think something may or may not be attempting to mimic me, but I don't know what to do. Help. I think that's one of the scariest mimic stories that I have ever read, and I also live a mimic story. I'm gonna email them back as well in case they don't see this video, but I would do multiple cleansings and try to ignore everything and tell everyone around you to just ignore it. I myself do not know how to get rid of a mimic. I can't get rid of my own. I know a few people have been successful in doing so. I have not, so I have no idea, but I do know that ignoring its existence calms it down. Sometimes it will pop back up periodically for no reason, but if anyone sees you, tell them not to acknowledge it. If anyone hears you, they don't acknowledge it. Yeah, I don't like the stuff disappearing. Cleanse yourself and your space for sure, and just keep doing that. But the fact that it's like physically touching you, that makes me feel like it's something else. Like, I think something is definitely mimicking you because people are seeing you in places that you shouldn't be. But I think something else attached to you, like a poltergeist type thing, and a cleansing will help with that. I have 2 follower stories to share with you today. Both are from the same follower, and they were told to them by their grandfather. Now, the first one is pretty horrifying, but the second one is so heart-wrenching that I have had to film this 3 times now because I keep stopping to cry. But we're running out of time, so if I am a slobbering mess by the end of this, I'm sorry, but we're just gonna have to roll with it. Let's start with the first one. The first story involved him and his brothers when they were younger. They didn't have windows the way we have now. They were basically just open holes that would get boarded up in the winter, and this happened in the summer. He told me his bedroom window was about 5 or 6 feet off the ground. One night they heard this horrible sound coming from the mountains behind them, but they didn't think much of it because bobcats and foxes make some crazy sounds. But they heard a couple of trees fall with it. So that's when he and his brother sit up because something's wrong. The brother that was closest to the window reached over to the nightstand and grabbed something to protect himself and his brothers. And it's a good thing he did, because at that same time, my grandfather looked over to see the shadow of something at the window. But it wasn't just a shadow. It was just the shadow of a hip down. So this thing was ginormous. Just then, a god-awful looking hand reaches in through the window and grabs my grandfather's brother. Thankfully, the brother was able to defend himself, and this thing ran off screaming, taking trees down with it, which they saw the next day. So they went to look at the woods the next day, and trees were just lying down in a perfect path where they heard this thing running. Now let's get into the second story. This one I've seen with my own 2 eyes, the ghost of a little boy. It's seen close to my mama and Pap's house, and this is also where my Pap grew up, middle of nowhere, only house around. On certain nights, you will see this boy in the middle of the road, and close to where you see him, there's a humongous rock. Here's the story of the little boy that my Pap acted terrified to tell me. He told me the story of these 2 little boys that were brothers who went fishing one day. And on their way back home, they decided to play on this big rock. One of the boys lost their footing, falling off the rock, hitting his head, and losing his life. The other tried everything to get him to wake up, but couldn't. So the other boy stayed for hours digging and digging to make a hole under the rock to bury his brother. The reason he did this is because he was afraid to tell his dad. Sorry about the cat toys. His dad was not a good man. He was a mean one, and he would hurt his kids for even just spilling a glass of water, so he was absolutely terrified to tell his father this. The brother lied and said his brother didn't want to fish anymore, so he left and came back early. The family searched and searched for this boy and never found him. My Pap said the boy's ghost is not angry, and the reason he won't leave is because he's watching over his brother to make sure his dad didn't hurt him anymore. My Pap's dad wrecked his car there and lost his life. Pap believes he saw the little boy and it scared him into crashing his car. Years later, I found out my Pap's brother went missing and they never found him. And I also found out that my Pap's dad was not a good person and hurt his kids, including my Pap. To this day, I believe my Pap was the little boy that buried his brother, and his brother saved him from his dad. Because my dad told me that if my grandpa's dad didn't pass in that car wreck, he probably wouldn't be here today.